Hi everyone. So last time we talked about a test that measures our electrical system, that was our EKGs. Today we're going to talk about our test that really thinks about and talks about how well the heart is actually pumping. So the first thing we do need to know here is a pulse. So what is a pulse? So your pulse is your heart rate or the number of times your heart beats in 1 minute. So this is going to vary from person to person. It really heavily depends on how much physical activity that you actually do. So athletes actually tend to have lower pulse rates at rest, which gives them room to increase when they exercise. So the reason why this is so beneficial for athletes is because, yes, their heart is still pumping even with the low pulse rate and bringing oxygen to their body, but once they exercise, that increase in their pulse rate is going to allow that oxygen to circulate more efficiently during exercise. So that's why that's so important. So just some things to think about when you are taking your own pulse or taking someone else's pulse. What you do want to use is your 2 first index fingers and not your thumb. So your thumb actually has a pulse of its own. So it's really important not to use your thumb so you don't get confused with the pulse rate, especially when you're taking a pulse of someone else. You could accidentally be taking your own pulse. So the 3 most common places that we're going to see that we take pulse readings is your carotid artery, your brachial artery, and your radial artery. So please take a second if you would like to and just try to take your own pulse here. So the carotid starts, remember, first 2 index fingers. It's going to be right under the curve of your mandible, right under your jaw. And what you want to do to get your pulse is to palpate. So you're going to press down and then release slightly so you're able to feel the movement in that artery. Your brachial artery, sometimes it's harder to find, but if you think about it, if your shoulder, it's directly diagonal from your shoulder, so it's going to be on the inside or the distal part of your elbow. So that's where we would find our brachial artery if you wanted to try to feel that. And then your radial artery is going to be on the opposite side, so the proximal side of your wrist, so right underneath your thumb here, which is why your thumb has its own pulse, is where you're going to find your radial pulse. Some pretty common ones for if there's traumatic injury to any of your limbs is definitely going to be your dorsal pedal and your posterior tibial. So again, all of these places are where you can feel a pulse. Some are harder than others, like the femoral and the popliteal pulse is really difficult to feel. But the 3 that I mentioned before, the carotid, the brachial, and the radial, are going to be probably the most common ones that you'll see. Brachial is going to be really important when we talk about blood pressure. So let's move on to that now. So blood pressure, what is it? It's the pressure exerted by your blood against the vessel walls. So again, when those ventricles contract, it creates an immense amount of pressure moving into your blood vessels, which is also the reason why we measure blood pressure in our arteries, because we're going to have the highest amount of pressure in our aorta and in our large arteries, like our carotid artery. And as the blood moves, you're going to see that that pulse or that feeling that pressure is going to decrease the further you are from the heart. So again, we use arteries because it's going to have a higher pressure than our veins. And as soon as it reaches the right atrium, our pressure is going to drop to 0 and it's going to start its pressure all over again as it pumps through the heart. So important here, you usually hear about 2 sounds when you are listening to your heart, the lub-dub, and those are the sounds of the valves in your heart closing. So again, when you're listening to your heart for this blood pressure, you're going to hear that lub-dub, and those are the sounds of the heart valves closing. And we're going to talk about what these 2 words mean here. So blood pressure is measured in systolic and diastolic pressure. So we're going to talk about what systolic means and what diastolic means. But a good example of a blood pressure here is going to be 100 millimeters of mercury over 70 millimeters of mercury. So the reason we use that is just because that's going to be our liquid measurement here. But you can see here that the larger number is usually on top. This is our systolic pressure, and this is our diastolic pressure. So when we're taking a look at taking blood pressure itself, the first sound, or S1, is going to be the closing of the tricuspid and the mitral valve. So those are the two valves of your left and right atria. During that ventricular systole, so that's when our ventricles are contracting. So the first sound you hear is your systolic pressure, and that's what you want to record. So as you're taking blood pressure with your blood pressure cuff, the first sound you hear is systolic pressure, and that's the first number you want to write down. So that's the top number here. And the measurement here is the pressure exerted by the return blood through the partially occluded brachial artery. So remember, I mentioned how brachial artery is going to be important with blood pressure. That is because when you have your blood pressure cuff on your arm, you are listening for the brachial artery. So that's going to be the pressure produced to the brachial artery, that first sound, our systolic. Our second sound is going to be the closing of the pulmonic and the aortic valves. So those are the valves going out of the heart, and that's going to happen during ventricular diastole, which is when the ventricles are relaxing. So it's the last faint sound is going to be your diastolic pressure. That's again the number you're going to record here. So it's the first sound that you hear, which is your systolic pressure, and the last sound you hear, which is your diastolic pressure, and that's how you're going to take your blood pressure. So again, when we're talking about systole, we're talking about ventricles contracting. When we're talking about diastole, we're talking about ventricles relaxing here. I do want to encourage you here as well to take a look at this video. It does give a really great explanation of how to take blood pressure, since we are not able to do it in class here. If you have any questions, please let me know and we will answer those for you.